The message arrived early in the morning, short and cold, like a knife that did not need momentum. The trip plans have changed. You do not need to come anymore. She wants to go with her real father. Daniel Harper stood frozen in the kitchen, his hand still holding a cup of coffee that was steaming faintly. The only sound in the house was the coffee machine hissing and then clicking off, as if it too had realized it had completed its final task. There was no explanation, no apology, just a statement enough to erase 14 years of a man's existence. He did not reply. The phone vibrated again on the oak table. Daniel turned it face down, as if that could make the truth disappear. Morning light spilled through the window, casting a long shadow over the chair at the head of the dining table. It was where he always sat. Melissa used to call it his spot, half joking, half sincere. Now the chair looked strangely abandoned, like a throne quietly stripped of its authority before anyone announced it. 14 years earlier, Daniel had entered this house with a single suitcase, a box of tools, and a promise. Melissa had been in her early 30s, then exhausted but hopeful. She took his hand and led him into the living room where her daughter sat doing homework. Sophie was 13, thin, her eyes guarded like a cat, unused to strangers. Her real father had been gone for years, leaving behind missed visits and apologies that arrived too late. Daniel had not come to replace anyone. He had come to stay. The years that followed passed in silence and responsibility. He drove Sophie to school, sat in waiting rooms, while she got Brace's signed tuition checks with steady handwriting. Whenever money came up, Melissa would smile, rest her hand on his arm, and say this was what family did. He believed her enough to never ask anything more. The phone vibrated again, this time a call. Daniel watched the screen light up and then fade. He knew exactly how the voice on the other end would sound, calm, reasonable, as if everything was unfolding exactly as it should. He walked into the hallway where family photos lined the wall. One picture from a company gala years ago caught his eye. Melissa stood in the center, Sophie beside her, and Daniel slightly off to the side, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. He had never noticed that detail before. Now he could not unsee it. Even in the frame, he had never truly stood at the center. Outside, the world continued as normal. Cars past a neighbor mowed the lawn. The radio delivered the morning news. No one knew that inside this house, a man had just been pushed to the edge of his own life. Daniel sat down in the head chair. He was not angry, not yet. What rose in his chest was not rage, but a frightening clarity. He began to connect the small details he had once ignored, the late company dinners, the hastily deleted messages, the way Melissa spoke of her boss with a mix of respect and restraint. The man who always appeared at the right time in the right place, as if he had never really left. A twist Daniel was not yet ready to face, but had sensed for a long time. He had been underestimated. To them, he was the quiet man who paid on time and asked no questions, someone easy to replace. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen that real power did not belong to the loudest person in the room. It belonged to the one whose name was on everything, the one who knew every number, every document, every foundation holding this house together. Daniel stood, pushed the chair neatly back under the table, the motion clean and deliberate, as if clearing away a part of his life that had finished its purpose. He picked up his phone, turned off all notifications, and set it down again. In that moment, unnoticed by anyone else, a line was drawn, not with words, but with silence. And from that line, a different story began, quiet, unannounced, and impossible to undo. Daniel Harper was not the biological father, but he was the only one there the first time Sophie fell and cried until she could not breathe. That moment happened on a rainy afternoon, many years before that morning text. Sophie ran from the porch into the yard, slipped on the wet tiles, scraped her knee blood, soaking through the thin fabric of her pants. Melissa was still at the office, her phone unanswered. Daniel lifted the girl carefully, his hands trembling slightly, afraid of hurting her more murmuring comfort, while blaming himself for not closing the door sooner. Sophie clutched his shirt, sobbing, calling for her mother, then falling silent, as if she had suddenly realized who was holding her. Daniel said nothing. He sat down on the steps, shielding her from the rain, wrapping his jacket around her small legs. From that moment on, he stepped into a role no one had formally given him. He never declared himself her father. He simply acted like one. The years that followed were stitched together by nameless acts. Picking Sophie up after school when Melissa worked late, checking math homework, sitting quietly for hours, waiting for the girl to find the answer on her own. Rushed dinners, early mornings, driving her to exams. Daniel did it all with a quiet patience, as if life would balance itself as long as he did not speak up. Melissa saw it. She knew, and she leaned on it. Whenever money became a sensitive topic, Melissa always used the same sentence, her voice soft, but certain, as if it were an undeniable truth. "We are family." Daniel never argued. He signed checks, set up automatic transfers, carried expenses that were never openly labeled as his. He did not count. He did not keep score. He believed that affection should not be measured. Sophie grew up within the stability Daniel provided, but she did not always recognize where that stability came from. To her, things were simply there. The house, the tuition, the short trips away. The man behind it all became like a wall, noticed only when a crack appeared. Sophie's biological father surfaced from time to time, a faint shadow passing through her life. Promised phone calls, late gifts, absences without explanation. Daniel never spoke badly of him. He did not need to. Time did that work, or at least he believed it did, until things slowly slipped out of rhythm. Melissa changed little by little, not enough to be called betrayal, but enough to tighten the air in the house like a rope pulled too far. Dinners canceled because of company events, calls taken in another room, messages that appeared and vanished. Daniel saw it all but chose the least painful explanation. He told himself it was work pressure, that Melissa was trying harder for their shared future. A name began to surface more often. A man from the company, Melissa's superior. The way she spoke of him was always proper, but in her eyes there was something else, a mixture of respect and restraint. Daniel felt it, but he did not ask. He did not want to become the suspicious man in his own home. Sophie changed too. She spoke less with Daniel, more with her phone. When her biological father began to appear more frequently, Sophie showed an excitement Daniel had never seen before. Not because she hated Daniel, but because this new presence carried the feeling of being chosen. And Daniel understood that this hurt more than rejection. What no one noticed, or no one wanted to notice, was that Daniel was not merely standing behind them. He was the foundation. The house stood because of him. The loans were paid on time because of him. The calm everyone took for granted existed because he quietly kept everything from collapsing. But Daniel's true power had never been in his voice. It lived in the control he had never used in signatures, in accounts, in documents neatly stored in a drawer. He never flaunted it. He did not need to. People tend to underestimate those who do not demand recognition. The second part of this story has no loud climax. It is made of small fractures spreading slowly, so that when everything finally breaks, no one can honestly say the signs were not there. And while everyone else kept their eyes on brighter lights, Daniel remained where he was underestimated, yet holding more than anyone realized. Daniel Harper realized he had been erased from the family picture on an evening that should have been nothing more than an ordinary party. It was a company anniversary event for Melissa, held at a large hotel in the city center. Warm lights spilled across the lobby music, playing just loudly enough to blur the quiet conversations underneath. Daniel stood beside his wife in a simple suit, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, out of habit. He was used to not being the center of attention. He thought he was fine with that. Until another man stepped into the space. The man was tall, his hair touched with gray, wearing the confident smile of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than asking permission. Melissa turned toward him immediately, her eyes lighting up in a way Daniel had not seen in a long time. She introduced Daniel quickly, lightly, as if reading out a minor detail in the middle of the real story. The man shook Daniel's hand, his grip polite but brief, then turned straight back to Melissa. The conversation moved on without Daniel. They talked about new projects, about numbers, about upcoming business trips. Daniel stood there hearing his wife's name spoken with open admiration. One of Melissa's colleagues made a half-joking comment about how indispensable she was. Laughter followed. Daniel laughed too, a beat slower. That was the first moment he clearly felt public humiliation, even though no one pointed at him directly. It was not loud, it was precise. It came from being overlooked in plain sight. Sophie stood nearby, phone in hand, her eyes flicking toward Daniel before turning away. She did not mean to, but the indifference made him feel smaller. Melissa was absorbed in conversation, unaware of the distance opening between them. The man, Melissa's boss, placed a hand briefly on her back as they posed for a photo. The gesture was quick, almost unconscious. But Daniel saw it, and he understood. A quiet twist settled inside him. The man most underestimated in that room was not powerless. He was simply the one who had never used his power. The party ended with laughter and congratulations. On the drive home, Melissa talked endlessly about work, about how highly her boss thought of her. Daniel drove watching the dark road ahead, answering in short sentences. Sophie sat in the back seat with headphones on, as if the world in front of her had nothing to do with her. No one asked Daniel what he thought. In the days that followed, the feeling did not fade. It followed him into every morning, every dinner. Melissa grew busier. Sophie grew more distant. Daniel began to understand something frightening. This family continued to function smoothly without his presence. At least they believed it did. One afternoon, Daniel overheard part of a phone call Melissa was having. She stood in her home office, the door partly closed. Her voice was low, tight. She spoke about pressure, about having to prove herself, about someone who was always there to support her when she needed it. Daniel did not listen to the whole conversation. He did not have to. Each word that slipped out was enough to complete the picture. He walked away without making a sound. His heart beat slowly, steadily. No panic, no explosive jealousy. Only the cold confirmation of something he had avoided for too long. Sophie changed in her own way. She began to mention her biological father, more often her tone both excited and cautious, as if afraid of hurting Daniel. Daniel listened, nodded, smiled. He did not compete for affection. He did not want to be the man who held on through guilt. But inside, he understood. The presence of that other man, both at work and in Sophie's life, was not accidental. It was a shift in power he had allowed to happen for far too long. What Melissa and everyone around her failed to see was that Daniel was not weak. He was the structure behind every stability they took for granted. And when someone like that is pushed to the edge, the dangerous thing is not anger. It is the silence that comes with awareness. The third part of this story doesn't end with an argument. It ends with a truth finally acknowledged inside a man long accustomed to enduring. From that party onward, Daniel no longer wondered whether he was being underestimated. He had his answer. And when a man understands his true position, everything that follows is only a matter of time. The message arrived at what should have been an ordinary afternoon, and this time It was not from Melissa. Sophie sent Daniel a short line, brief and colder than silence. She said she would be seeing her biological father this weekend, that everything had already been arranged, and that Daniel did not need to worry. You do not need to worry. The phrase hovered in his mind, striking thoughts that had not yet fully formed, then dropping like a final period. Daniel sat in his car, with the engine off his hands, resting on the steering wheel longer than necessary. The supermarket parking lot was quiet wind, pushing dry leaves across the pavement. He read the message again, not to search for hidden meaning, but to confirm what he already knew. Decisions were being made without him. He remembered the times he had once been the first call, when Sophie ran a fever in the middle of the night, when she needed a signature for a school trip, when Melissa couldn't get home in time. Those moments were now being replaced by plans he was not invited into. Daniel did not reply, not out of anger, but because he understood that any words he offered now would be misread. His silence was no longer a habit of endurance, it was beginning to take the shape of a choice. That evening Melissa came home late. She set down her bag, slipped off her shoes, spoke casually about work. Daniel listened and nodded as he had for years. But there was a new distance between them, invisible yet sharp. Melissa felt it. She paused and looked at him longer than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked. Daniel looked at her and realized it was the first time in a long while she was truly waiting for an answer. He could have said everything. He could have asked about the late nights, the vanished messages, the hand on her back at the party. He did not. He simply said he was tired. Melissa nodded, seemingly relieved not to explain. She turned away, carrying with her the sense that everything was still under control. She did not know that control was already slipping through her fingers. Night settled in. Sophie did not join them for dinner. She stayed in her room, the door half closed, music spilling into the hallway. Daniel stood there staring at that door, as if it were a newly built boundary. He remembered nights when Sophie could not sleep, when she would quietly open the door and sit beside him on the couch. Back then, their world had been only the two of them, and an old movie. Now Daniel was the one left outside the door. He walked into the small office at the back of the house, a room few people noticed. The bottom drawer let out a soft protest as he pulled it open. Inside were neatly arranged folders, a habit he had kept since before marriage. Daniel went through them slowly. Property documents, bank statements, insurance policies. His name appeared again and again, clear and uncontested. A truth emerged not new, but finally faced. Daniel was not just living in this house. He was the one keeping it alive not through loud authority, but through steady presence. The twist did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It came through a cold comparison between what he had given and what he had been allowed to keep. The result made it impossible for him to deceive himself any longer. Sophie stepped out of her room and paused when she saw the light still on in the office. She hesitated at the doorway. Daniel looked up and smiled a smile without blame or pleading only an invitation to speak. She came in and sat across from him. Sophie talked about her biological father, about new stories about the feeling of being noticed. Daniel listened without interrupting. Inside him was a deep sadness, but also a new calm. He understood then that affection cannot be held together by unconditional sacrifice. When Sophie left, Daniel remained alone. He turned off the light and closed the drawer. The decision had not been spoken aloud, but it had taken shape. He would not compete. He would not explain. He would prepare. The fourth part of the story ends not with a grand action, but with a quiet shift inside a man, long accustomed to standing behind others. While everyone believed he was being left behind, Daniel was learning to step to the side where the final choice would belong to him. The man appeared on a rainy afternoon without warning, standing on the front porch as if he had never left. Daniel Harper saw him through the glass and recognized the face instantly, despite the years Victor Lane Sophie's biological father, the man who vanished from his daughter's life and returned only after everything had already been built by someone else. Victor stood straight in a dark jacket, wearing the confident smile of someone who believed he had the right to walk into any place. Melissa opened the door before Daniel could say a word. She froze for half a breath, then softened. Her shoulders relaxed, her voice changed. Victor said her name like an old habit. There was no awkwardness, no distance. Daniel stood behind them, silent like a familiar shadow in his own home. Sophie ran down the stairs, and when she saw Victor, her eyes lit up in a way Daniel had never received. She rushed forward, wrapped her arms around him, laughing, talking fast, telling him everything at once. Victor bent down, listened, rested a hand on her shoulder, as if he had always been there. Daniel felt the air in the room shift. No one introduced anyone. No one explained. Victor walked inside, set his bag down, looked around with a measuring gaze, as if inspecting something that belonged to him. Melissa followed, offering drinks, asking questions. The two of them spoke like people accustomed to making decisions together. Daniel sat down, back straight, hands resting on his knees. He watched. Victor talked about work, about opportunities, about wanting to make up for lost time with Sophie. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed his words carried weight. Sophie listened closely, nodding again and again. Melissa smiled, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Daniel, then away. The twist did not arrive as a dramatic declaration. It came as a small truth, sharp as a blade. Victor said that Sophie deserved to be with her real family. The room fell silent for a brief moment. Daniel looked at Melissa. She did not argue. She did not correct him. She simply stood there and let the words pass as something natural. In that silence, Daniel understood that his place had been decided long ago. Sophie turned toward him, hesitation in her eyes. She seemed as if she wanted to say something, then stopped. Daniel smiled at her gently and calmly. He did not blame her. He understood how powerful it feels to be chosen. Victor stood and stepped closer to Daniel, extending his hand. This handshake was different from the one at the company party. It was firmer, longer, carrying an unspoken message. Victor thanked Daniel for taking care of Sophie all this time. Thanked him as if Daniel had only been holding a place temporarily. Daniel shook his hand with measured strength and nodded. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Because he had realized something. Real power does not come from being called a father. It comes from deciding what happens next. The visit ended faster than Daniel expected. Victor and Sophie left together, talking about weekend plans. Melissa stood at the door watching them, one hand resting on the frame, as if leaning on something solid. When the door closed, she turned back toward Daniel. Did you see that she asked, her voice mixed with worry and challenge? Daniel stood up and met her eyes. I saw it very clearly, he said, and nothing more. He did not need to. The truth had already laid itself bare. That night, Daniel did not sleep. Not from pain, but from clarity. He sat at the kitchen table under the familiar yellow light. In his mind, the final pieces fell into place. Victor hadn't returned for Sophie alone. He returned because everything was ready, and Melissa, through her silence, had allowed it. The fifth part of the story does not end with confrontation. It ends with final confirmation. Daniel Harper was no longer in a marriage. He was simply a man living in a house with people who had decided he did not belong to their real family. And when a man understands that he does not look for ways to stay, he begins to plan his exit. The truth did not come from a confession, it appeared in a bank statement. Daniel Harper stared at the computer screen in his small home office, the blue light hardening the lines of his face. At first, it was just routine. Checking accounts. reviewing expenses the way he had done every month for years. Then one number did not line up. It was small, not enough to cause panic, just enough to make a man who lived by precision stop. He enlarged the transaction line. Then another appeared, steady, recurring, transferred to an account he did not recognize. The beneficiary name was not Melissa. It was not Sophie either. It was an intermediate name, empty, designed not to attract attention. Daniel did not rush to conclusions. He had never been a man driven by emotion. He opened another tab and cross-checked the dates. The transfers matched the periods when Melissa said she needed money for work, for projects, for relationships. Explanations he had accepted without asking more. His heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from recognition. He pulled out old folders, insurance contracts, previous statements. A pattern emerged. Not large, not loud, but enough to create a separate stream quietly splitting from the family finances. Melissa had not taken everything. She had withdrawn little by little, careful enough to avoid detection, just enough to build herself an exit. The twist lay there. The man treated as an outsider in his own family was the only one who could see the entire picture. Daniel was not just paying the bills. He understood where the money was going. He remembered the evenings when Melissa sat at the dining table, with her phone face down, the times she stepped away to take calls, the meetings that ran longer than planned. Every fragment now locked into place with brutal clarity. Daniel closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, eyes shut for a few seconds. There were no images of romantic betrayal in his mind. No tears, only the cold realization of a plan prepared long ago, one he had been the last to know about. In the living room, Melissa was on the phone. Her voice was low and tight. Daniel caught words like pressure risk and a familiar name, Victor. He did not step out. Truth did not need an audience. Sophie came home later than usual and passed the office, noticing the light still on. Her eyes paused on Daniel's face. Something had changed. A new caution, as if she sensed the direction of the house had shifted. Daniel smiled at her, a calm smile that unsettled her, more than anger would have. She seemed ready to ask something, then stopped and went to her room, carrying the sense that the man who had always been there was quietly moving somewhere else. Night settled in. Daniel sat alone, printed pages spread neatly around him. He did not call a lawyer yet. He did not confront Melissa. There was no need. Everything he needed was already on paper. Daniel's real power had never been his voice in the family. It was the silent control he had always refused to use because he believed love should not require it. But when love was replaced by calculation, that power was no longer a weapon. It became a shield. He understood then that Melissa had not only prepared to leave emotionally, she had prepared financially. She had chosen the timing, and somehow she believed Daniel would not notice until it was too late. Daniel stood, gathered the documents, and placed them into a new folder. His movements were slow and steady. No shaking, no hesitation. In that moment, he was no longer the underestimated man standing behind everything. He was the only one in the house who knew exactly what was happening. Part 6 of the story has no shouting. It has the soft rustle of paper, the late office light still burning, a man quietly shifting from endurance to control. And when someone like Daniel Harper finally looks straight at the truth, the next steps are no longer guided by emotion, but by choice. Daniel Harper faded out of the family's rhythm within 3 days, and no one noticed right away. It was not a loud disappearance. He still came home on time. He still greeted them. He still sat down for dinner. But something had withdrawn from the air. A presence that had always carried weight now folded inward, so quiet that the house seemed larger. Melissa sensed it first. She did not say anything, but questions began to collect in her mind. Daniel no longer asked about schedules. He no longer reminded her about bills. He no longer offered opinions when she talked about work. She was used to him being there as an invisible anchor. When that anchor stopped responding, the emptiness surfaced immediately. Sophie noticed in a different way. Daniel no longer waited up when she came home late. He no longer texted to ask if she had eaten. For a moment it felt freeing, then uncomfortable. The absence of attention revealed a gap Sophie had never been forced to face before. Daniel spent his time outside the house, not hiding, but observing. He stopped at an old coffee shop near the bus station, where few people recognized him. He sat alone listening to spoons clink against cups, rain tapping the glass. In his mind, options lined up neatly. No crowding, no rush. One afternoon, Daniel met an old friend, Mark Collins, who had worked in finance. They spoke like two men accustomed to silence. Daniel did not tell the whole story. He asked only precise questions about ownership, about joint accounts, about who truly controlled what when things fell apart. Mark did not ask why. He simply answered. Each answer was a piece Daniel needed. The twist was not that Daniel discovered he had power. He always had. The twist was that he chose not to use it to strike back, but to exit cleanly. He began to organize not belongings, but information. Daniel opened a new account in his own name, moved what was necessary, kept everything within legal lines. He did not hide. He did not rush. Everything unfolded like a carefully planned transfer. At home, Melissa grew restless. She asked if something was wrong. Daniel said he needed space to think. The words made Melissa pause. She had never thought of Daniel as someone who needed space. In her mind, he had always been the one willing to step aside. Sophie overheard the conversation from the stairs. She stood still and listened. There was something in Daniel's voice that frightened her, not anger but a calm that could not be shaken. That night, Daniel drove out beyond the city and stopped at a turnout overlooking the river. The water moved slowly, reflecting scattered lights. He sat in the car without music, without calls, letting his thoughts pass. 14 years appeared not as a chain of suffering, but as a list of responsibilities fulfilled. He did not regret them. He only realized he had stayed too long in a role that no longer belonged to him. When Daniel returned home, it was nearly morning. He went straight to his office and took out the prepared folder. He did not sign anything yet. He only checked it one last time. Certainty gave him an unfamiliar feeling, light and clear. Melissa woke earlier than usual and saw the office lights still on. She stood in the doorway looking at Daniel like someone she knew who had switched languages. She wanted to ask, but did not. Part of her understood that if she did, the answer would not be what she wanted to hear. Sophie came downstairs and saw them both. The air was tense but unbroken. She sensed that everything was about to change in a way no one could fully control anymore. Part 7 of the story has no decisive action. It is the pause before the shift, the moment when a man chooses silence, not because he is weak, but because he is choosing his timing. And when Daniel Harper stops reacting, it is not a sign of surrender. It is the sign of power being gathered back in, cleanly, without the need to prove it. Daniel Harper signed his name on the cruise cancellation paperwork before the sun had fully risen, and by noon, everything had shifted in a direction no one in that house had expected. There was no argument, no threats, only a short phone call, his voice so calm that the person on the other end asked him to repeat himself to be sure. Daniel confirmed each detail, listened to the terms, then ended the call with a polite, "Thank you." When he set the phone down, he did not feel relief. He felt a space that had just been cleared. Melissa realized it that afternoon when she checked her email to print the tickets. There were no tickets, no confirmation, only a brief notice stating that the trip had been cancelled at the request of the account holder. She read it once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. She called Daniel immediately. The phone rang once, twice. Daniel did not answer, not because he was busy, but because he had decided not to react anymore. Sophie came home as the sky began to darken. She found her mother standing in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp in a way Sophie rarely heard. When Melissa ended the call, her eyes met Sophie's. Something had cracked quietly, but enough for both of them to feel it. Sophie asked what happened. Melissa did not answer right away. She looked around the house as if searching for something to lean on, then said that Daniel had cancelled the trip. Nothing more. No reason. No emotion. Sophie fell silent, confusion tightening in her chest. Daniel was in his home office, the door partly closed. He heard footsteps, heard Melissa call his name. He did not open the door immediately. He let a few seconds pass, enough for her to understand that things no longer moved on the old rhythm. When he stepped out, Melissa stood there with her arms crossed, trying to keep her voice even. She asked why he did it. Daniel looked straight at her, neither evasive nor gentle. He said the trip was no longer meant for him, so he no longer had a reason to pay for it. The sentence was short, but it landed like cold stone. Melissa reacted quickly. She said he was overreacting. She said Sophie needed that trip. She said Victor had already arranged his time. Daniel listened until she finished. Then he asked a single question, his voice flat and steady. Was he going? No one answered right away. The silence stretched just long enough for the truth to speak for itself. Sophie stood on the stairs gripping the railing. She looked at Daniel, then at her mother. In that moment she realized a battle was unfolding without raised voices, and that frightened her more than any shouting ever could. The twist in this part was not that Daniel cancelled the trip. It was that it was only the first step. He did not stop there. That night when the house was quiet, Daniel drove to the office of a lawyer he knew through an old referral. The appointment was arranged faster than he expected. He did not tell the story with emotion. He laid out documents, accounts, contracts, the name on the ownership papers. The lawyer listened, nodded, then said something that made Daniel feel unexpectedly light. Everything was clear. On the drive home, Daniel pulled over and watched city lights reflect across the windshield. He did not feel triumph. He felt alignment, right timing, right direction, and most importantly, right with himself. At home, Melissa did not sleep. She paced, checked her phone, typed messages, and deleted them. She felt control slipping through her fingers, but did not yet understand how. To her, Daniel had always been the one who stayed, the one who gave way. Acting without warning left her disoriented. Sophie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She thought about the lost trip, about her biological father, about Daniel. For the first time, she wondered who had truly chosen her all those years. Daniel returned home, turned off the living room lights, passed through the kitchen. He did not look back. He already knew what he needed to know. Part 8 of the story does not end with a clear victory. It ends with an irreversible shift. When a man long underestimated begins to act according to his own choices, everything around him is forced to change. And from that moment on, Daniel Harper was no longer reacting to life. He was leading it. The house was listed for sale on a morning so quiet that the birds outside sounded like witnesses. Daniel Harper signed the authorization papers with steady handwriting, no tremor. He stood in the living room where familiar sunlight poured through the windows, landing on the wall that once held family photos. Small nails still jutted out bare, like traces of things removed long ago. There was no farewell ritual, no hesitation, just an action taken at the right time. The realtor arrived early, speaking in a professional tone, asking technical questions. Daniel answered cleanly. Market price, closing timeline, flexible terms. It all sounded like an ordinary transaction, because to him, it was. The house no longer symbolized family. It was an asset, and assets are handled when the truth is clear. Melissa did not know yet. She was busy with calls and new plans, believing the recent wave would settle. To her, Daniel was always the one who adjusted, who softened the edges. She believed he would wait, that he would warn her, that he would hesitate. That belief was exactly what kept her from seeing what was coming. Sophie did not know either. She went to school, came home, lived within the familiar orbit. But something in the air felt off. Rooms grew emptier. Closets were rearranged. Daniel appeared less often, and when he did, his calm was unsettling. She did not ask, partly from fear, partly because she was not ready to hear the answer. The twist here was not that Daniel decided to sell the house. It was that he had always had the right to do so. His name alone was on the papers. No dispute, no ambiguity, no permission needed. Power does not have to be fought for when it already belongs to you. The following days moved faster than Melissa expected. Showings were scheduled, calls were confirmed. A serious offer arrived. Daniel read every line, weighing not with emotion, but with the clarity of someone who had taken the time to understand exactly what he was doing. That night, Melissa received an email from the brokerage. She read the subject, then opened it. The address appeared clearly. Listed. In process. She read it again, then once more, before standing abruptly, her chair clattering behind her. She called Daniel. This time he answered. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice high and shaking. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she paused to breathe, he replied in a low, slow voice. He said he was doing what needed to be done. The house was no longer a place where he belonged, so he was not keeping it. Melissa reacted fiercely. She spoke of family, of Sophie, of the years they had shared. Daniel listened. Then he said one sentence without raising his voice or threatening. "Family is where you are allowed to stay, not where you are replaced." Sophie stood at the top of the stairs, hearing the entire call. She did not come down. She clutched the railing, her heart pounding. For the first time, she understood that adult choices could shake the ground beneath her feet. She wanted to call Daniel her father, but the word caught in her throat. The signing date came quickly. Daniel went alone. He signed exchange documents, confirmed details. It ended with a polite handshake. When he stepped outside, the wind was stronger, carrying the scent of damp earth. He breathed in deeply. Not relief, not pain, just a sense of being in the right place. Melissa came home late that day. She looked around as if the house had changed shape. It had not betrayed her. It simply no longer belonged to her. Sophie sat in her room, silent, thinking about what she had always taken for granted. Daniel packed what he needed. Not much. He left the rest where it was, not out of generosity, but because he did not want to carry what no longer belonged to him. Part 9 ends here. There is no clear victory or defeat. Only a man who acted when the moment arrived. When someone is underestimated for too long, people forget that silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is the pause before a door closes. They came back on a quiet weekday afternoon, carrying the easy relief of people who believed everything was still intact, and in that exact moment, the house was no longer waiting for them. Melissa's car turned onto the familiar street at the familiar speed. She was still smiling, talking to Sophie about the trip, about how getting away had made everything feel lighter. Victor sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting against the window, his eyes moving slowly over the neighborhood, like a man surveying territory he believed was his. None of the three were prepared for what came next. The gate was closed. There were unfamiliar footprints pressed into the lawn. A new planter sat near the porch, slightly off to one side. When Melissa slid the key into the lock, nothing happened. She turned it again harder, then once more. Faster. Still nothing. The door stood firm, cold, and unresponsive. Victor stepped forward and knocked hard. Sophie stood behind them, her bag still over her shoulder, the smile she had worn only moments earlier dissolving. Something began to wobble in her eyes, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Footsteps sounded from inside. The door opened a few inches, the chain still fastened. A young man appeared awkward, but trying to remain polite. He apologized, said they had moved in that morning, introduced himself, explained that all the paperwork was in order, then asked gently if he could help with something. Melissa laughed, not a warm laugh, but a sharp, brittle sound. She told him he was standing in her house. The young man hesitated and called back to his wife. A pregnant woman stepped into view behind him, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, her expression tense but steady. The air shifted in a single breath. Victor raised his voice, anger spilling out onto the porch. Melissa pulled out her phone, dialing repeatedly, hanging up, dialing again. Sophie stood frozen, her face drained of color. She looked around as if waiting for someone to step out and say this was all a terrible mistake. The police arrived faster than Melissa expected. 2 officers, one younger, one older. They asked for documents. The young man handed over a copy of the contract, the new owner's name clearly printed. The older officer read, slowly nodded, then turned to Melissa and asked whose name was on the deed. The question landed without force, yet heavy as stone. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. She turned to Victor. Victor avoided her gaze, looking off to the side. The moment lasted less than a second, but it was long enough for everything she believed in to collapse. At the same time, miles away, Daniel Harper sat in a roadside diner, a cup of coffee, long gone cold, in front of him. His phone vibrated. A short message from the realtor said, "They are there now." Daniel did not reply immediately. He set the phone down and looked out the window. A truck passed by. The sun was lowering light stretching across the pavement. He drew a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to accept that this moment had been inevitable. The call came soon after. Melissa. Daniel answered on the 4th ring. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice rushed and breaking. Daniel leaned back in his chair and spoke slowly, each word measured. He said he sold the house. No explanation. No defense. Melissa said he had no right. Daniel replied calmly that his name was on the papers. She said it was the family home. He answered that family does not push someone out and then expect them to keep the roof standing. Victor cut in furious, saying Daniel had gone too far. Daniel paused for a beat, then asked a single question that stopped everything. "Where were you for 14 years?" There was no answer. Sophie took the phone. Her voice was not loud or accusing. It cracked on one word, really. She said she did not think Daniel would actually do it. Daniel replied in the same steady tone that he had said he would not stay where there was no longer a place for him. The call ended without goodbye. Back at the house, the police gently advised Melissa to leave. The new owner closed the door, the chain removed, and then secured again. Victor stood silent, saying nothing more. Sophie turned away, her eyes red but dry. In the diner, Daniel finished the last sip of his coffee. Bitter. He stood, paid the bill, and stepped outside. There was no sense of victory, no regret, only a deep quiet, like a door closing at exactly the right moment. This part of the story does not offer a clear winner or loser. It simply marks the moment when final choices come due. And for Daniel Harper, the cost was no longer his dignity. It was the road ahead, open and empty, but for the first time in many years, entirely his own. The summons arrived on a gray afternoon, placed in Daniel Harper's hand, like a weight that did not need to be lifted, and in that moment, he understood that nothing was truly over. It had only shifted into another form. It was not a divorce, not yet, but a complaint tied to the house, a late attempt to pull time backward. Daniel skimmed the page without frowning, without sighing. He folded it carefully, and set it on the table beside his car keys, treating it like just another item to be handled, in order nothing more. The hearing date came sooner than he expected. The mediation room was small, lit by even white lights carrying the mixed scent of old paper and cold coffee that naturally lowered voices. Melissa arrived late, her heels striking the tile too loudly in the quiet. Sophie followed, head down, shoulders drawn inward as if trying to make herself smaller. Victor came in last, hands in his pockets, a thin smile on his face, as though this were simply a meeting that could be won by confidence and volume. Daniel was already seated back, straight eyes calm. He did not bring a story with him. He brought documents. When the mediator suggested keeping things simple, Melissa spoke first. She talked about family, about the years they built together, about Sophie's pain, about how cruel Daniel's actions had been. Victor nodded along, adding a few remarks about morality and what a man should do. The words stacked up one after another, as if speaking long enough might bend the truth itself. Daniel waited. He did not interrupt. He did not correct a single sentence. He let each word be placed on the table, brick by brick, until a wall formed in front of them. When it was his turn, he stood and set the folder down. The sound of paper meeting the table was clean and solid enough to slow the room. He did not raise his voice. He said he had not abandoned anyone. He had simply stopped paying for a life he was no longer allowed to live. Then he opened the folder and slid the pages forward. Ownership documents, payment records, maintenance bills, and on every page his name appeared again and again, steady, uncontested, without emotion. The mediator read, slowly, nodded, turned pages, unhurried. That was when Victor cut in, saying Sophie deserved that house. Daniel looked at him for the first time since entering the room, his gaze not challenging, just direct and empty. He asked Victor what he had contributed beyond showing up at convenient moments. The question landed, and the room fell silent. Sophie looked up. Her eyes moved from the folder to Daniel, and something broke open quietly, but unmistakably. The mediator concluded that the sale of the house was legal, with no grounds to reverse it. Melissa sank back into her chair, as if her last support had been pulled away. Victor leaned back, saying nothing more. No one applauded. No one claimed a grand victory. But the matter was settled without argument. Outside sunlight fell across the courthouse steps. Daniel drew in a slow breath, feeling as though he had finally set down a weight he had carried for years. Sophie came out last and stopped a few steps away from him. The silence between them lingered, not heavy, just cautious. She said she had not known everything. Daniel nodded and said he knew, and that knowing late still mattered. Sophie did not apologize, not yet, but she stayed an extra beat, as if wanting to say more, then didn't. Daniel did not push. Some things need time to find words. His new life began with small things: a rented room near the river, a table big enough for two, but usually holding only one mornings, watching the water drift by, while an old radio played and coffee brewed just right. No one called. No one needed him to fix anything. The quiet felt strange and light. Melissa sent a short email about forwarding mail and a bill she thought he still owed. Daniel forwarded it to his attorney and did not reply. Silence was no longer a defense, it was a tool. One early autumn evening, Sophie texted a single question: "Could we talk sometime?" Daniel read it longer than necessary, then replied that they could, when both were ready to listen. They met at a coffee shop halfway between them, not sitting too close, not avoiding each other. Sophie said she had not realized the cost Daniel had paid. Daniel said he was not keeping score, he was keeping promises. The words sat between them, waiting to soften. They did not go back, but they stood more firmly in the truth. And there, this part of the story closed not with complete reconciliation, but with a new foundation. A man long underestimated stepped out of the noise without carrying bitterness. His real power was not in winning a house, it was in knowing when to stop and how to stop, in a way that still allowed him to keep living. The morning Daniel Harper realized he had slept through the night without waking, he knew something fundamental had changed. It was not that he slept longer, but that he slept deeper. There were no more thoughts circling endlessly, no old voices in his head telling him to give in, to wait, to hold everything together for someone else. The small rental room by the river filled with clean, direct morning light. Daniel got up, made coffee, opened the window. Mist rose from the water, cold and fresh like a greeting that asked for nothing in return. His new life was not loud, it was assembled from very small pieces. Morning walks along the riverbank, listening to water slide over stone. Simple lunches with no need to rush. Evenings at home with an old radio, playing a familiar song all the way through. No one called asking him to fix something. No one asked what he would do next. And for the first time in years, Daniel did not need an answer. Some days memories returned, but they no longer tore at him. He remembered the old kitchen, the head chair at the table, the way he used to slide the chair back in whenever the air grew tense. He remembered how carefully he had lived, trying not to take up space. And then he saw the truth he had once refused to face. He had called it love. In reality, it had been unpaid labor for a respect that never came. Melissa did not reach out anymore. Neither did Victor. Their silence was no longer a punishment. It was the natural emptiness left after an old structure collapsed. Daniel did not feel pleased or bitter. He simply kept living. Some things, when you leave them at the right time, no longer require explanation. Sophie texted a few more times, not urgently, not demanding. Short, careful messages like someone learning how to knock on a door. They met again. The coffee was still bitter. The conversation was slow. Some sentences did not need to be spoken. Some needed time to be spoken correctly. Daniel did not lecture. He did not prove anything. He was simply there in the right place, at the right pace. It was a kind of power he had always carried without knowing, and now he used it gently. One evening, Daniel stopped by the old place where he had once sat alone during the early days. The owner asked how he had been. Daniel smiled and said he was fine, and this time it was not a polite answer. He understood what fine meant now. It meant not needing to defeat anyone, not needing to keep a role just to be allowed to stay. It meant being able to sign papers, pack boxes, close a door, and keep going without carrying resentment. The final twist of this story was not the house that was sold or the mediation that ended. It was that Daniel did not turn into someone else to seek revenge. He became himself for the first time, unobscured. His real power did not need applause. It showed in how he chose silence when it mattered, spoke when it counted, and left when staying would have meant erasing himself. Winter arrived early. The river turned steel gray. Daniel bought a heavier coat and learned how to cook for one without burning everything. He slept steadily and woke lightly. Some nights he thought about the road ahead, not endless, but wide enough to walk straight. And he walked it. If you have ever been underestimated, ever called family, until it was no longer convenient, remember this. Dignity does not need to shout. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply a series of well-timed choices, a signature, a packed box, and a steady step forward. And silence, when it is chosen, can be the greatest strength you will ever have. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment to say you heard it. Press like if you believe in leaving at the right time. And subscribe if you want to stay with stories about finding your footing after the ground beneath you has given way.